We have a great mini track coming up next year for discussion on challenges to network automation adoption. Our participants will be Jeff Doyle, Chris Cummings, Dan Kelcher, Jeff Kala or Kayla? Kayla. And one of the fun things about events like this is you run into people that you've seen years ago, and you run into people who have been your friends and quiet mentors for years, and I'm pointing at Jeff Doyle over here. So please welcome Jeff to start us off.
Can y'all hear me okay? All right. So we'll get going here. I get the lucky first go at it here. So yeah, as Scott mentioned, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges that we've noticed as a group, and we all kind of brainstormed some of them. So I threw a kind of a entire brain dump of the ones I've heard from being a consultant, being an architect, and I decided to focus on the three there highlighted in orange. So I'm going to talk about network automation testing, the data problem, and then the outage paradox. So one of the big drivers I've seen slow adoption is definitely when it comes to how do I test this before I go to production. And what I'm going to kind of focus on today is covering some of those challenges. One of those challenges for me that I've seen is the concept of a digital twin for your infrastructure just for testing is very expensive, especially if you're going to do it right. So doing that has kind of shown that the cost kind of outweighs the benefit in a lot of ways. Next, one of the major challenges is emulation. So not only emulating network equipment, but also emulating external connections. So when I say that, you can think of like a BGP connection out to an ISP. It's hard to emulate that when you're doing automation testing. And then finally, the general one-to-one device to a virtualized option simply is lacking out there today. So in the current testing frameworks that are out there, a lot of times the entire end-to-end of an automated workflow is just not quite there, or it's too challenging to accomplish. Whether that's how do I test this external integration or what it might be. Also, how do you actually load test automation frameworks? And then finally, just hardware specifics. As much as we want to believe we're getting closer and closer to abstracting that away, we're not quite there yet. So I'm going to take kind of a turn here and say why this should not be a reason to slow your adoption. And one thing I'm going to talk about is I truly feel that standardizing your configurations of your fleet and being able to validate your operational state versus your configured or intended state is actually going to solve a lot of the problems you're attempting to solve by introducing like a real detailed automation testing framework. Okay, so the data problem. This is my second one. We've all seen the quote, "Data's the new gold," right? That's true with automation as well. And it's also a foundational topic to automate your network properly. So every solution out there requires good data, whether that's your monitoring tool with SolarWinds, spine and leaf architecture with like ACI, or even a config gen engine with maybe Cisco NSO or maybe Nautobot's Golden Config app. So I'm going to focus on three main data areas: configuration data, state data, and kind of data governance. So why they're challenging, right? So data governance is hard in general. What system owns this data? What team owns this data? How will it be updated? Who's allowed to update it? It gets complicated. You got to be able to track that. So that's one that's not necessarily a piece of data itself, but it's something you have to solve in order to automate your network properly. Next, configuration data. Almost every solution out there, configuration data, you need to be able to aggregate data from different systems. So you might have a single source of truth. There's still going to be other systems you're going to have to integrate with. So that's a challenge for sure. And finally, just kind of the data translation. And when I say that, Maybe a good example would be OSPF with Cisco has some OSPF configuration under the interface and the routing protocol, where Junos has it only under kind of that protocol stanza. So it's just a challenge in general, and data doesn't always directly map one-to-one, even when you're talking about the same exact thing. Finally, state data. State data almost always requires the need for some type of ETL, so extract, transform, load, right? And it supplements your state data to provide a lot more information for you and a lot more information into your automation framework itself. So last one, outage paradox. This one's easy. I think we've all heard these ones, right? So it's more of a theoretic problem. As a consultant, I've heard this over and over. Doesn't matter what size the client is, automation can break my network faster. I'm scared of a larger outage caused by automation. So you have to be able to really take those with a grain of salt. You're not going to be perfect. You have to be able to iterate and just in general be able to handle the idea that you're going to have problems and learn from your mistakes. So the one thing I'll hear pretty constantly is actually the lack of trust in an automated process. People don't trust it. It's black magic, right? What's happening in the back end, I'm not sure. And that concerns a lot of enterprises. And then finally, I just mentioned there, learn from your mistakes. I kind of link a Facebook article or Meta now, back on a network outage they had a few years back, how automation had some pieces to it, and how they literally learned from their mistakes and how they fixed problems and how they added testing for it. So that is what I have, and I'll hand it off to Dan.
Hey, it's a Mac. I'm not a Mac person, so hopefully I can press the next button. So hi, I'm Dan Kelcher. I'm a solutions architect with IP Fabric, and it actually put these slides together, and in like most of the conversations that have happened, I've kind of been biting my tongue because I've wanted to jump in. But really, we'll start off with what is automation. So Webster's defines automation. Not actually going to do that to you. You're welcome. But really, though, when you do think about what is automation, really what it comes down to is you're taking a task, a repeatable thing. You're basically, here's the steps, let's do it. So if we take this idea, if I went to any of you and said, okay, here's a set of directions, hopefully most of you can read it, so I'm not going to read them all to you. But if you went through and followed those directions, and then from a verification standpoint, well, did you do each one of those things that was asked? Then we get to a question of, where are you? Did you reach a destination? Did you, what happened? Like, you had the instructions, you followed them, now what? So if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going to. There's been a lot of talk of like the CI/CD pipelines and the state versus config data and all that. It's, where am I? Where do I want to go? So now taking this and actually putting in a network example. How many people have run the switch port trunk allow command or whatever and forgotten add? Everyone. So, how many people, when running a command like that, the typical verification would be something like, well, let's show interface and let's see if the config is on that interface. We're not necessarily, if you don't know what VLANs were there, you make the change. Yep, that VLAN is there, but I don't know where I was. So, bad things. So this is one of the things that I've, like, every time that somebody's been talking earlier, like this, this makes me happy. I've gone through a lot of presentations on network automation, and a lot of times when people are talking, like, they'll focus on, here's this Python script, or here's this very specific thing, but how do you get there? And for me, one of the biggest things is just the data. What do I have? I've got maybe a couple Visio documents that are 3 years old. I've got an Excel spreadsheet with some data in it. And then there's that other stuff in a closet that nobody really knows. So being able to automate against that is difficult. So essentially the workflow that I've got here, first thing that you need to do is start with just state information. People have talked about that already. The state is what's on the network, what's running, what's happening right now, because that's what's true. I take issue with the term source of truth because the network is the source of truth. Everything else is a repository, but the terms are out there. I'm not going to win that one. I'll try though. But anyways, so if we can collect that state information, the second thing then is the intent. Where do we want it to be? So there's been talk of intent and configuration and all that. We got to compare those two and then figure out what the difference is. That's where we can put in the automation workflows as far as here's the actual config changes that need to be made. One of my favorite things when talking about automation at this point, that automation could be, here's a script that I hand to the network, or like the junior engineer that's up at 2 in the morning to do the change. It doesn't necessarily need to be Ansible or Terraform or what have you. It's how are you making that change? Whatever that process is, that change now is going to change the state of the environment. Then does that fit to what the intent is? And it's understanding those two. So for me, I think a lot of the big challenges here are basically understanding what that state is, having that state data, because I think a couple people have mentioned this already. There's not usually like a single place that you can go. If you've got Juniper and Cisco and Arista, you've got 3 different tools if you're lucky. So pulling all that together, building that up, being able to build the data model, that information now gives you the baseline to start building what your automation would look like. So I think that's the last, yeah, that's my last slide. So, hey, and I didn't go too far over. So you're up. Good luck.
All right, well, thank you for that. Thanks for having me. My name is Chris Cummings. I'm a network automation software engineer at the Energy Sciences Network, part of the Department of Energy, Berkeley Lab. Basically, we run a big WAN, and we do some automation. That's the key takeaway. So for my part of the challenges to network automation adoption, I wanted to kind of first talk, well, let me just give you an overview of what I'm doing. So first I want to talk about how automation is not the same as orchestration, and want to go a little bit into why they're different and how I think that matters. I also want to point out one of the points I'd like to make is that organizational vision matters, and that's a big challenge I think for most places trying to actually implement this stuff. Is, if you have one person wanting to implement automation, but the rest of the organization doesn't, how do you push that through? So you got to have good vision from the organizational level. You got to be able to define your services. You got to know what you're trying to automate, what you're trying to offer, what you're trying to configure, things like that. Finally, in the last slide, I'll tell you how to do an orchestration, and you can get your money's worth out of the conference. So, automation orchestration. So an automation is, the automatic operation, control of equipment, defined by Webster's, a process or a system, right? So this is like a linear process. I'm going from A to B, and maybe that's it. Orchestration is where you're going to be executing multiple automations together. And that's basically, you're trying to achieve this desired, state of a process or a system. So I think it's important that there's a distinction made between those. Because to me, automation is maybe a script, maybe an Ansible playbook, maybe something like that. But it's doing one thing, it's probably talking to one system or maybe 2 systems, but pretty simple. Orchestration is when you take all of those things and you tie them together into the bigger picture of what you're trying to do, right? So organizational vision. In your organization, is automation viewed as a cost center? To me, that's a pretty big barrier to adoption, right? If you've worked in enterprise, right, it's very common that the networking group isn't maybe central to delivering, the widgets that we manufacture at, Acme Corp. Even if you are in a networking organization, though, you still have this problem when you're on an automation and orchestration team. That you aren't necessarily the core product being offered. So you need to figure out how to actually sell the benefits of what you're doing for the organization to the higher ups and make sure that orchestration and automation are actually viewed as integral parts of making widgets or delivering network services or whatever it is we try to do. Really talk to them about what's the benefit. For us, it's consistency. For others, it might be we want less people to do more. And it's different for other organizations. But being able to talk the business language to communicate that is really important. You also got to think through a lot, who's going to actually drive it, right? Is it going to be a grassroots individual movement? That's very possible. I've seen it happen. It's tough, though. You're going to be really fighting a lot of organizational inertia. And if you don't have proper support from the powers that be, it can be really tough. And ultimately, you know, you're going to need a bigger team. You're going to need a lot of people to do this, right? And going back to that, you know, are you viewed as a cost center, right? If you don't properly advocate for what you're trying to accomplish, and you are viewed by, you know, management as a cost center, they're going to look at you like perhaps like janitorial staff, right? And they're going to say, you know, well, we could do this, but this is cheaper. It's like 1-ply toilet paper, 3-ply toilet paper. Maybe you're saying I want the 3-ply automation, but they're only going to give you 1-ply. So you got to really be able to sell that, right? But anyway, defining services. I think this is probably the hardest part, at least in the organization I'm in, is actually figuring out what do we offer? Especially if you're a really old organization that's been around forever. Ours has been around since before the internet was really commercial. So there's a lot of inertia there, right? And you know, our goal has always just been, well, we connect things to do some science, which is really great. But defining that as a concrete thing that you can give to somebody is actually really tough. And I think most organizations face this problem, right? Especially if you're internal IT to a business. Like, well, you know, we provide internet and things like that. But being able to break those down into actual services that you sell to customers, even if it's internal, is really important. Then once you kind of figure out what you're trying to sell, which maybe you do actually sell, and I think if you're in an organization where you do that, it's actually a lot easier because there's whole business people dedicated to that. But you got to kind of figure out, you know, what do we actually need to deliver these things? What are all the dependencies in the chain so that we can, you know, go and build an internet transit service for a customer, right? And who's responsible for that? You know, who manages our peering contracts? Who manages, you know, our BGP policy and all of these bits of config that are sprawled all over the network that you've got Bob who's like really into layer 2 VPNs. Like you gotta know all of the people that are responsible for these things and learn from them why it's done the way it is. And then ultimately, the lifecycle of the service is, I think, incredibly important. And that's another big difference between automation and orchestration. Automation is generating a bit of config, perhaps, and then you go copy paste it on a router, or Ansible copies and pastes it for you, right? But orchestration, you're involving the entire lifecycle of a customer asks me for this. We go through a business process of deciding whether or not we want to actually engage with them. We then do all of these steps, and then eventually some config gets applied on the box. But that is a very, very small part of what is actually required. And being able to track that life cycle of what you're offering the whole way is really important. All right, so how do you do an orchestration? To summarize, really, have strong organizational alignment. Really work and network within your organization to make sure that people want what you're doing. If you're trying to push automation in an organization that doesn't want it, and you're not able to convince people and show people the benefits, it's probably not going to work and you shouldn't try it. And I'll even say something maybe a bit controversial. Some networks maybe don't need automation. Maybe they don't need orchestration, right? Because if you're in an organization where that's just not desired and not valued, and the business is able to keep functioning properly, maybe that's okay. So you got to really not view this as some like sacred thing that you have to do because I went to NAF and AutoCon 0 and they said you should automate stuff. I think you should automate stuff, for the record. Invite me back next year, Chris. Again, define your services. Make sure you know what you're trying to do. Knowing's half the battle, as they say. And if you know what you're trying to offer, you can break that apart into the pieces needed to orchestrate it much easier versus coming at it backwards. Understand who's responsible for things and make sure to have their buy-in. And ultimately have an army of good people. You can do it on your own, but it really helps to have good people. Convince management that you need staff and work with people that are already in the organization to help skill them up. Show them, teach them, train them, take what you've learned and apply it there. All right. Jeff, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, I'm Jeff Doyle, and I've learned that my beard is entirely inadequate for this committee. I'm a Director of Solutions Architecture at Juniper Abstra, and shameless plug, Cummings, co-author of Cisco Press book on network automation fundamentals. So I want to just briefly go through things that, as I was listening to these terrific talks, I realized most of my talk is really just summarizing that, which is good. Then I'm moderating the rest of the session. So let's see. Naturally, I'm the one person who, there we go. So as far as some challenges to network automation, one of the things I see is a problem with definitions. And this kind of, in my opinion, is not just with network automation projects. It is a lot of engineering projects that I've seen where people don't have good definitions. They don't go into the boardrooms for the people that control the purse strings and be able to adequately sell what they want to do and why it's important. So, these kind of questions of what are we automating? How are we automating it? What are the expected results? And you've certainly heard, and you're going to hear a lot more about single sources of truth. We'll talk about that a little bit. What are the single sources of truth for my network? I want to just a quick little plug for one of my favorite books. Is a small, actually business-oriented book by a guy named, his name, Douglas Hubbard, called How to Measure Anything. And it's basically, that you need to quantify your business projects. And what it really boils down to, the book has lots of good ideas, but what it really boils down to is if you can't quantify something, you haven't asked enough questions. So keep asking, get to that point where you boil things down to, here's how I can measure this, and now I have results and quantities. Indecisions. Several slides on this, but looking at just commercial products versus do-it-yourself solutions. DIY solutions certainly have relatively low CapEx versus high OpEx, whereas commercial solutions tend to have high CapEx and low operational expense. DIY, where they really shine, is you can custom build a solution for your environment, whereas off the shelf, it's a product that's being sold to as many customers as they can, and so they may have a lot of bells and whistles you don't need. How do you adapt that to your network? DIY tends to have very long development cycles, depending on what you're doing, and obviously necessary maintenance. How do you keep it going so that as your network progresses, your solutions progress with that? It's a very general statement. As opposed to commercial solutions that have a quick rollout and tend to be regularly updated. And one of the things I was thinking about, and I didn't put it in these slides, is that DIY as a further decision point is you have to ask yourself, does DIY mean I'm building my own team, my own DevOps team, or a subset of your operations team to build these solutions, or are you bringing in consultants that can do this for you? It depends a lot on your budget and so forth. Other indecision points. Where to start and at what scale? Are you automating everything, or are you starting very small? And I think for most people that have done automation, they would probably say, well, we started small and gained experience and built out. And then going back to that first slide, what is the business case for what you're doing? You've got to be able to get the C-level people on your side and ready to open the purse strings. You need to be able to express to them what are, in numbers, the benefits of what I want to do, and what is it going to cost. which goes into what skill sets do I need? And we've talked a lot about that. Big indecision point is AI/ML, which is still kind of growing and developing and maturing. Am I getting in too early? Am I getting in too late? Should I wait and see how AI better becomes a tool for me to use? And finally, fear. Losing visibility from my network. John this morning in his keynote even said, people that have some very odd ideas about automation, is it going to take over my network, or we're going to, like the Matrix or the Terminator or whatever, and which is obviously a bit silly, but there's people that don't understand networking, don't understand automation, that you have to sell these things to, and you need to be able to convince them about that. And, everybody has said this, it's an old cliche, don't automate a broken process. But that becomes a point of fear also. What happens if I automate a broken process and simply make that broken process propagate much more efficiently in my network? So that's my small piece here, and now I get to get out of this role and become a moderator for the panel, and I'm counting on all of you for questions, and then I don't have to do anything. So maybe I'll just start off by asking if there's questions.
Do I get to ask questions? Is that okay?
What's that? Say again?
Do I get to ask questions?
You get to ask questions,
Okay.
yes.
So, Chris, I'll pick a net and move beyond it. Automation versus orchestration. I'll make this constructive. Where would you put cross-technology silo coordination of automations in that taxonomy? And just as a side on that, I think this is evidence of the taxonomy comment that John Willis made earlier today. But give it a shot.
Oop, there we are. Yeah, to me, so I guess reading into what you're saying, maybe like if I was to have a process that takes some routers and configures the network to accept some servers, then I would also go and cross a silo and configure some hardware on the server side, and then load an operating system on it, and start to install some applications. To me, that's orchestration, and that's where the real power is. Because you can configure the network, which is great, but networks don't exist just to be a network typically. Unless you're a service provider, sometimes you're just there to be a pipe for people. But typically networks are there to serve applications. And so you really have to think through the entire thing you're trying to offer. Very few people are building a data center just to have a really cool leaf spine network that just sits there and doesn't move a single packet. So being able to coordinate with the systems that are actually putting things onto the wire is where I would say that falls under orchestration. Thanks.
Just a kind of maybe a really simplistic thought on my part. I ask a lot of simplistic questions, but do you see automation being more task-oriented, whereas orchestration is more workflow-oriented?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I think that orchestration is a collection of automations, and so you're really doing some more meta coordination between things. Like a great example of a individual automation would be adding a VLAN to a trunk port, right? That's one automation, and then an orchestration might be configuring my network to serve DNS. And there's going to be a whole bunch of steps that happen in your workflow. One of those is ultimately going to be adding a VLAN to a port somewhere, right? So that's where it kind of breaks down on those lines for me.
Thanks. Other questions before I ask my own questions? Oh, come on. Well, yeah, they're going to make me ask simplistic questions again. So, Dan, thank you. You bailed me out.
That's right. Less of a question, more of a statement. You mentioned before, container lab and all the rest of it, need lots of RAM if you're going to do a big design. Don't be afraid of going and picking up a second-hand HP workstation, or better yet, if your company's retiring a whole bunch, and just jam as much RAM in as you can. Mm-hmm. I picked up one with 768 gig of RAM for 1,000 Australian dollars. What's that, 500 in freedom units? And that'll get you going if you're doing something that's a large-scale, deployment, digital twin.
Yeah, I totally agree. You can actually scale up those virtual labs a little bit more than you think, and you can over-provision, I think, more than you think. Even running Container Lab with nested VMs inside of Docker containers, which is like turtles all the way down weirdness, you can really scale that up. I mean, I haven't done it yet, but from back of the napkin math that I've done, even for our network, I really do think we could run a exact copy of our network where each router has 16 gigs of RAM assigned to it on a single host if we really tried. Yeah.
What do you use for emulation?
Yeah, Container Lab is definitely my favorite. I will plug that all day long. It's the best piece of software to ever exist.
Okay, let's see.
Yes, my
Yes.
question is to a gentleman on the left side with regards to the test automation. Will you be able to expand more on your experience? Just curious if you find a good workflow or a tool set that you can use more on your network. We find it especially challenging across multiple vendors to find a good tool that we could use for testing in the automation environment.
Yeah, so I do agree with Chris. I think there is definitely solutions out there, and I wasn't trying to make that sound like don't test your automation. More or less take it slow. Don't make sure that you have to have that at the beginning. But yeah, I think at the right scale, there's plenty of options out there. I've done a lot with PyATS. I've done a lot with Batfish. There's a lot out there that can solve, I would say 75, 80% of the problems that we're trying to solve. And then if you, pigeonhole some Container Labs or CML or whatever your virtualization software of choice is, you can definitely solve those problems. But I would say focus more on kind of what I mentioned in my talk around standardizing configuration and being able to validate what you're doing after the fact can actually bring a lot more benefit than some of the testing frameworks can, in my opinion.
Another question?
Yeah, I had a question also about test automation portion of the presentation. The word intent kind of struck me as being a little bit problematic because in my experience, it can mean a couple of things. It can mean the intent, what state of the network you intend to make it, or it could mean the intent of what the behavior of the network is. And those things can be and usually are quite different. And it seems to me like getting the intent to mean how the network behaves is kind of the crux of network automation and how we make it successful. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've got to say, working for someone who is kind of selling the idea of intent-based networking, the way I usually explain it, I mean, it really is marketing, but the way I explain it for intent is that it's my expectations of my automation, which is probably pretty shallow, but that's one definition.
Yeah, one way I'd explain it too is, you're basically, you've got an idea of what you want to do, then something has to translate that into reality, and that's where like orchestration and automation fit in. That's kind of my breakdown of it.
I'm curious how you guys are handling digital exhaust, like SNMP and syslog messages as part of your automation frameworks. Also, what's next for that? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? How's it going to change in 10 years? Thanks.
In 10 years, we'll still be using SNMP, I'll say that. But we might be using other things. Digital exhaust, that's an interesting term. So you're kind of saying like just the pollution of data, just the vast amounts. Is that kind of a fair way to describe that? Okay, yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, that's a good question.
If we're still using SNMP in 10 years, somebody did something horribly wrong. I think really the big thing is it's kind of trying to change what you're, like SNMP is great to collect like a specific counter, but trying to use that to really understand what a network is doing and what's going on, that's not really what SNMP does. So it's I think moving away to something that's going to kind of have a more of a a holistic view of what's happening instead of like this interface, this counter, that doesn't scale.
Yeah, kind of expanding on that is, kind of going to what Jeff, you said about the data problem. When you're collecting all this data and you're going to get flooded with just massive amounts of data in your network, where do you find a divide? How do you normalize that data? Because one piece of data that may be completely meaningless to you and is actually fogging your overall view of the network may at some other time be a very valuable piece of data. How do you determine those things?
Yeah, I mean, for one, I think ETL we're hearing it more and more. And just since I work at Network to Code, I'll say Nautobot and using that to be able to really transform data. So maybe I'm getting a syslog message that is coming into my telemetry stack. It might not mean everything it needs to mean how it comes off the box. So being able to transform that and use your single source of truth or your source of truth data to really enhance that, I think can make that data more usable to more people. So kind of what you're getting at, it might not mean anything to a NOC employee, but for an engineer, it tells them exactly what they need to know. So I think being able to really transform data and say that with that transformed state is very important.
Yeah.
You had me at intent. No, I think intent is an interesting, that's one of the areas I think we failed in DevOps is that, so I mentioned somebody, the CF Engine and Mark Burgess, he created this thing called promise theory. And one of the problems we had, which was, and I still think today, even when you talk about Terraform and you talk about Ansible, it's still a deterministic model. Things shall look this way every 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And there's a point where complexity just mandates that cannot be so. And Mike Dvorkin, when he created ACI, right, he brought Mark Burgess in to try to implement promise theory there. So it's an area where I think works better for networking because you live in the ultimate non-deterministic world. And I think to change the mindset that we can deterministically script or create things, and that's great, you have to do that to manage things. But throw out the notion that you're ever really going to know exactly what anything looks like. Physics demands that will never be so. Yeah.
And that's why I really brought up the idea of expectations intent, for whatever word it is, it's really a matter of, are you getting what you need from your network? Right? Are you getting what you need from your automation? Which goes back to that first slide I did on definitions. Yes, please. Do we have, I'm sorry, I didn't see somebody over here. There was a long line over here, so let's go to this side.
All right, my name is Mahesh, and I think it was in one of the slides where maybe it was Jeff's slides that he was talking about life cycle of a service. And we talked about creation of the service, but to me, life cycle also means that service will go away after some time. Mm-hmm. And what needs to be done at that point might be different from when the life cycle actually is initiated.
And one thing I'll add to that is when I terminate that instance of that service, what happens to everything else that might have depended upon it? Can I prevent somebody from terminating something that's actually in use? Or if there's bits of configuration that are in use by multiple services, can I terminate that bit of config without taking off stuff that's already in use? Like with a lot of the idempotent style ways of doing it, it's very hard to only delete what's not in use. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of implementations. Yep.
Let's take one more question. I think we've got 2 minutes left, so this might be the last question. Right. Sorry, apologies for the others. Go ahead.
Thanks. My name is Alex Bortok. I wanted to get back to the question of testing automation. And just from a personal experience, I know how, requirement to write tests when you do software development, it really slows you down at the beginning, like the development. But then at a certain point, you're like, boom, if you have tests, you can now merge so faster without afraid to break things. So is there a moment in the network automation where having tests really unlocks the velocity of the team? Like, what is it?
About 1 minute.
I really think that you need to have kind of synthetic user test style things. And so if you start to build those style of tests that say, you know, given this source data, we should be able to ping from here, ping from there, file transfer from here to there, et cetera, build up those sorts of tests. Then you can change out all of your automation, all of your vendors, everything, and still have the overall idea of what you're trying to accomplish with the service available. And I think those are the kind of tests that we should be working towards, as well as smaller unit tests. You know, make sure that my automation does produce this config every time. Those are all valuable as well. But I really am a big fan of the synthetic end-to-end tests.
Okay, with that, I think we're out of time. My apologies for everybody that didn't get to ask their question, but these guys are certainly available to you at the next break. And please give a round of applause for our panel.